All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the day 2 of the NCGIS conference, everyone. And we've got a great presentation lined up right now. Thank you for being part of it. So the title is Assessing Nature-Based Options for Flood Resilient Communities in North Carolina. I'm going to let Narcissa introduce herself and go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to this conference. I'm excited to be here. My name is Narcissa Pricope, and I'm an associate professor in the Earth and Ocean Sciences Department at UNCW. Today I'll be talking about a new project that is funded by the North Carolina Sea Grant that has an ultimate goal of assessing and prioritizing where nature-based interventions can be made in some of the most flood vulnerable communities in North Carolina. My co-presenter today, well, she's not a co-presenter, but she did a lot of work on this, is my graduate student, Greer Shivers here. And I'll talk in a little bit about sort of the context, but not to preach to the choir. Everybody knows why we focus so much on flooding and flood resilience in North Carolina. We are incredibly vulnerable to risks such as coastal flooding, storm surge, sea level rise, and we have a kind of an ongoing problem of inflating population numbers in this low-lying environment we get to call home. So those risks, those sort of three-pronged risks posed by storms, by heavy rainfall, which we're experiencing beautifully right now, as well as events such as river overflows that lead to pluvial flooding, are some of the biggest drivers here in terms of what makes communities in coastal Carolina vulnerable. And to add to that, I'm sure everybody has seen a version of this before. We have the increasing problem of localized subsidence, saltwater intrusion, and high tides that are magnified by global sea level rise in such a way that there's a consensus that planning for the sea level rise and adapting to that sea level rise is an issue of great importance to municipalities and counties throughout the coast. So a little bit of quick background on how this research started. It was essentially, it came out of a collaboration with several folks throughout North Carolina, where we were taking essentially a GIS approach to understanding the physical and social vulnerability of the North Carolina coast. So we did an assessment of 28 coastal counties to look at where there is physical vulnerability of people in the form of structures, basically built infrastructure, so buildings. So we looked at the base flood elevation of over 128 structures throughout the study area you see here, and essentially created an index of exposure to basically to flooding in the 100 level, in the 100 year floodplain. So with that, just simply on looking at the structures that are currently in the 100-year floodplain, we ascertained that 45% of the structures throughout the study area are vulnerable just based on where they are built to a 1% storm event occurring. Then we looked at the same area and looked at social vulnerability, trying to understand whether communities that are more socially disadvantaged, whether economically or demographically or socially from any perspective like that, where those communities are located. And we were able to highlight and pinpoint using the US Census Bureau 2010 data here, some of the known basically high social vulnerability locations, such as the military bases and essentially major cities, the areas around major cities, all of this occurring basically away from the coastline. And then we essentially created an integrative index of vulnerability at the block group level, which hadn't really been done before in this way at this scale. So we were able to tease out places where we have an intersection of that high physical vulnerability based on where structures are currently built in the 100-year floodplain, and who lives there, what the socio-demographic profiles of those people are, and you can find all the paper, the date, as well as the data in the Journal of Environmental Management. So this was a cool exercise. It helped us sort of zoom in on some vulnerable locations. So anything in black in here are places that are both physically, essentially, in terms of that hazard, that exposure, both physically vulnerable as well as socially vulnerable. But we are looking at a future with about 63% more days at risk of hurricane-induced flooding in this region, as well as a huge 70% of especially single-family and manufactured homes that are underinsured or uninsured. So that means that this vulnerability will continue to increase and to just get magnified over time. So then what we did next is we've been working a lot with Craven County, with the city of New Bern, and there we essentially took this model and compared it to impacts from in the field, on the ground assessments of impacts resulting from Hurricane Florence, for example. And again, this is just an overview. We have a lot more data in here, but interestingly enough, about 98.2% of the buildings that were assessed as damaged as a result of Florence were actually in these block groups that we had predicted as being at very high vulnerability in this region. So with that and other moving pieces, and together with colleagues in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, we were successful in acquiring a Carl Havens Regional Resilience Grant about less than a year ago, which is focused on essentially assessing where green infrastructure interventions such as land conservation, restoration of wetlands, living shorelines, beach dunes, and things of that nature can provide more cost-effective flood mitigation, specifically focusing on essential transportation networks. So while the previous work that I just kind of gave you a glimpse of was more focused on the communities themselves at the block group level. So we were taking a more integrative approach between not necessarily looking at the infrastructure on the ground other than built buildings, and also looking at the social variables in there. This effort, and I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is more focused specifically on transportation networks, because as we saw with Hurricane Florence, a lot of the damage and a lot of the longer term effects of that flooding were seen in basically a lot of the transportation networks being cut off in a lot of these regions. So for this project, this collaborative project, the Southeastern Resilience Initiative, we're working with Cape Canaveral, Garden City in Georgia, Georgetown County in South Carolina, and in North Carolina, we are lucky enough to have 2 partner communities in this effort. Again, this effort is all about working with these partner communities to essentially look at where and what is vulnerable from the perspective of infrastructure, and that relies heavily on GIS, and then try to prioritize and identify nature-based solutions. So we're working with New Hanover County here and the city of New Bern, which has been an ongoing collaboration for myself and for us here for a while. The other part of this this Carl Havens grant is to understand the economic impacts of this green infrastructure. So what we're hoping to be able to do is compare essentially using an economic model called REMI. And I'm not an economist. There's another person on the team who's responsible for that. But to look at this and take our sort of gray versus green infrastructure solutions and do an economic comparison and see how they stack up, so that we can answer questions such as what are the most critically at-risk transportation corridors in all of these communities? How are they being threatened by short-term, i.e., your regular tidal floods or your regular storm flooding versus bigger events versus sea level rise over time? And then what are some of the expected socioeconomic costs to these communities in the absence of action to mitigate these vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. So again, the overarching goal here is to do this work, but to do it in a comparative approach between the 4 states and learn from one another, with at all times the input and the feedback of the communities that are our partners for this effort. So as I said, we're working with New Hanover County and the city of New Bern, and they both have been chosen because they have experienced in the last several major storm events. They have experienced significant downtown, significant flooding downtown, and also they are experiencing very rapid urbanization and population growth. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking a little bit about specifically what we've done out of the process of this. Again, this is a GIS conference, so I'm mostly focusing on the GIS components of this, but to highlight that if we look at the way that we conceptualize of quantifying and assessing and identifying threats and hazards and vulnerabilities, right? We do it sort of in a iterative, adaptive sort of way by looking at what's changing in terms of dynamics of land use, land cover, population, what are the stressors affecting those systems, and then essentially trying to put an assessment on that infrastructure, or put an assessment on the people. So I showed you that before we were looking more at the people, but now we're shifting to the infrastructure. So the US has a resilience toolkit that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, that goes through essentially this approach that I just described. Essentially, there's an exploration and assessment of the hazards, and our identified threats and hazards in these communities are flooding, coastal flooding, storm surge flooding, and pluvial flooding. And then an assessment of the vulnerabilities and risks, and which is what I'll focus on today. And then the next step is to essentially identify and then prioritize using or based on continuous stakeholder input, what the best options are to mitigate for some of that flooding. So quickly, New Hanover County, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it here, but it is the smallest of the North Carolina counties, but has the second fastest growing population in the country. So it's a high priority for understanding how we can actually mitigate flooding. What we also have going on here is, as everybody knows, this is the terminus of I-40, and especially during Florence, I-40 was cut off for days, and basically all access to New Hanover County was cut out for days. So it's a natural place to start focusing on that infrastructure flood. So just a few maps here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. These are simple sort of bathtub model DM-based approaches to look at to make several modeling scenarios of sea level rise, and then add a storm surge to those sea level rise scenarios. So if we do that, and then we start sort of zooming in, we can quickly identify most vulnerable locations. And this is a pretty standard approach for risk assessments of this kind. And then we can start teasing out where the roads, so again, focus being on infrastructure here. So we can start teasing out the roads that are vulnerable, and where specifically, what kinds of roads they are, and so on and so forth. And all of those assessments are, again, based on, in this case, scenarios. But what we did next is we took a data set published by Schaefer and Smith in 2020 that had identified, essentially mapped out using radar and other satellite data, the actual maximum flood extent from Hurricane Florence. So we essentially looked at that and did the same kind of a GIS-based approach to look at what actually was inundated in New Hanover County as far as infrastructure. And about 36% of the roads in New Hanover County essentially were at some point in time during that event inundated or had standing water on them. So that's a huge number. So what we did after we completed this assessment and went through a webinar series with our collaborators and the community we work with, is we had a very long and engaged workshop with the New Hanover County Planning Decision and their Resilience Office to basically take this information, take these GIS-based assessments of impacts and vulnerability and risk, and translate them into a focus area. So we've actually identified in consultation Pages Creek, for example, as one of the most impacted communities, and now we're sort of focusing in on designing or identifying here within Pages Creek at a scale that is manageable within the county, where we can prioritize such nature-based interventions. And similarly, but on a completely different scale and much more advanced, if you want to think about it that way, in the sense of planning for resilience, is New Bern, the city of New Bern in Craven County, which sits on the Neuse River and experiences significant downtown flooding, usually in their historic downtown during even not major storm events. So we did a very similar assessment. Again, we're treating these communities sort of in the same way up to this point. So we're doing that vulnerability assessment, same scenarios, same VM-based approach. But here, again, if we start looking at this, then it's a little bit shocking, right? Because you see a huge chunk of the historic downtown of the city being potentially inundated, even with a 1-foot sea level rise scenario. So we look at what is at risk, try to get a quantification of that. Then the next step of that, again, is to compare to an actual event. And we've done this in, like I said, in many different ways, but based on the same Schaefer-Smith 2020 data set of maximum flood extent, 27% of the New Bern roads were actually inundated because of Florence specifically. So in that one flood event, and these are significant numbers. Basically, up to this point, we've essentially completed that part of identifying the hazard, identifying the vulnerabilities and where the risks are. And essentially, the next step of the process here, because it is a process, is to think about what are the socioeconomic impacts, right? So how are these infrastructure impacts going to translate into socioeconomic impacts, and that's where our economic modeling comes into place, and then prioritization of these storm mitigating landscapes, like I talked about in the beginning, wetlands, living shorelines, the restoration of existing infrastructure can be prioritized. So we are now in the stage of having these ongoing, very in-depth collaborative efforts with our two focus communities, one that hasn't necessarily started implementing some of these nature-based solutions, the New Hanover County case, and New Bern that is currently in the process of stakeholder engagement in order to build a city-wide resilience plan. So in both of these cases where we have this nice sort of distinction between the two communities, we're looking for areas where it makes sense to implement different nature-based solutions, and we're focusing on that engagement, on the feedback, and on the process. So identifying a process that can then be taken and translated or augmented by what is being learned from the South Carolina, the Georgia, or the Florida case, and essentially, we are also in this process working with collaborators within the city of New Bern and their resilience team, and leaning on existing work that's been done by the folks over at UNC Asheville with the NEMAC Center there and their resilience evaluation and citing tool. So in all of this, we are incorporating and focusing on the process of not recreating work that's been done, but adding to that work. So again, we are in the stages of figuring out how we could use a wealth of existing data and multiple teams sort of focusing on this problem, and in consultation with stakeholders to identify places that make sense to prioritize for nature-based conservation. And that's all. I'm going to stop with this today. It was a little bit, like I said, more of an overview of what we're doing and where we are in the process. And I'd really like to put it out there that I am interested in hearing if folks have ongoing projects that where we can collaborate and supplement, or just overall questions or suggestions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting and definitely much needed work that you're doing, and so good to see that how much analysis you're doing for our coastal citizens, and the plans that are in the works to try to mitigate some of those flooding impacts. So yeah, please, anyone, if you have questions, please type them in the chat, and we do have a couple questions that have come in, so I'll ask you those. One is, have you looked at assigning times to the sea level rise levels?
Yes, yes, and that's, I sort of hinted at that, but I kind of skipped over it. As I said, these exercises that we've done are more or less DEM based, but we're hoping to be able to use the NOAA slosh models and assign times to that. So we'll use a combination of slosh and SLAM models to look at time frames. So we'll probably do 2045 is what I would like to do in order to improve on these. Because that is also the time frame that a lot of the long-term land use plans for the communities that we work in are based on. So we're going to try to match that.
Okay. And another question, what would you say you were most surprised at by this study?
So far, actually, I was incredibly pleasantly surprised at the receptivity of our partner communities and their willingness to engage, and just their willingness to collaborate and exchange data and sit down and talk about this. So that's, as far as what I necessarily hadn't experienced before, that was a very exciting surprise. That it's nice to see that we can finally talk about sea level rise and talk about all of these things without people not being willing to engage.
Yes, that's great. Yes, thank you. Okay, and another question, would you have any advice for municipalities that are not coastal, but that have routine sizable weather events? Data is usually scarce for high intensity rainfall. And I was thinking the same thing as far as whether or not some of these, obviously not using sea level rise, but just the flooding data could be used for counties that are further inland.
Oh, yes. The part of this study that, and I didn't show this, nor did I have time to talk about this, but this study here that got at the overall sort of vulnerability to flooding was then followed by a work by another one of my students who graduated, where we took down essentially imagery right after a storm event, and you can start mapping out where you might have water pooling just using a near infrared band or something like that, or using, but I mean, there are such limited stream gauge data sets throughout North Carolina. So that's one of the limitations, which is why I've done a lot of this work away from the coast, just based on satellite imagery, because in a way it's a little bit more reliable than what we have from our river gauges. But yes, it could be done, and it should be definitely done.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree, definitely. Another question, do you envision being able to provide local governments with an array of nature-based options that address specific needs at specific sites?
Well, that I haven't shown any of that, but that's exactly what we're working on right now. And like I said, that is the ultimate goal of this grant, is what I'd like to be able to do is almost a decision tree, where if your community is riverine versus coastal, then you would go through essentially a process of elimination or of decision making, where you're looking at what's driving the problem? What is the hazard? What drives it? Is it coastal flooding? Is it pluvial flooding? So inland riverine flooding, and then based on that, basically be able to come up with what is it restoration of existing wetlands? Maybe is it creation of rain gardens, biosphere, things like that. But yes, that's the goal, and it'll be something that's accomplished across 4 states, not just we're just going to bring to the table what is relevant for North Carolina communities, these 2 communities for now.
Okay, good. You're asking some good questions, so keep them coming. We've still got a few more minutes. So another one, do the models factor in population growth? And they're curious about the degree to which nature-based solutions are affected by population density, and or would the nature-based solutions call for limiting population influx into an area?
That's a hard question, and I would say that not at the moment. What we're doing does not explicitly account for population growth, although we are focusing on some of the fastest growing. So implicitly and indirectly, we are accounting for that. And I think maybe I wouldn't say that we'd have to limit necessarily population coming to an area, because we don't really operate that way, right? In this state, we don't have growth boundaries and things like that. But we could develop more with the sustainability in mind. So there could be, I mean, that one of the most effective things might just be having to put in place low impact development guidelines that would have to be followed by developers, which it's going to be a hard one to pull in North Carolina, isn't it? But yes, I think it'll just be a matter of, if we keep developing with that understanding of where is the highest vulnerability and mitigating that vulnerability as you move into the future.
Okay. Well, good answers. I noticed that you said this work has been published. Is that correct? Is there a journal article that if people want
to? Not the work on the nature-based solutions. This is the ongoing work that's been published, is the work that identified did a broad brush assessment at the block group level. So and there's an ArcGIS online site that if folks are interested, and like I said, the data is all, if you go to this publication, Pricopa et al. 2019 in the Journal of Environmental Management, there's a linked paper that has all of this data in a giant geodatabase that can be downloaded, and municipalities can explore essentially just what's in the floodplain, what are the structures in the floodplain, who lives there, what are some of the main social demographics of those communities, and start playing around. That part is published, but the second part not yet.
Well, excellent. So I want to give people a couple minutes to move to the next session, but we've had I really appreciate your presentation today, and I'm sure that if anyone has further questions, there was a question about a recording, and it should be available in YouTube in a few weeks. So look for it there if you'd like to share it with people you know. So thanks again, Narcissa.
Right. And thank you very much, Jeff. Okay, bye-bye.